The year is 64. A small number, a quiet number. The kind of number that fits easily on a single line of parchment. But beneath that small number lay a city that contained perhaps 1,000,000 human lives. The largest city in the Western world. The largest city, perhaps, that humanity had ever built. A city of marble palaces and crumbling tenements. Of senators in purple-edged togas and beggars in rags. Of temples and brothels and gardens and granaries. A city where 7 hills rose above the Tiber, crowned with the houses of the rich, while in the valleys below, the poor lived stacked in wooden apartment blocks that climbed 5, 6, 7 stories into the smoky air. The city was called Roma, Rome. And in the summer of the year 64, the city of Rome was ruled by a young man. He was 26 years old. He had ruled for 10 years already. He had inherited the throne when he was just 16, after his mother poisoned his stepfather with a dish of mushrooms. He had then, some years later, ordered the murder of that same mother. He had ordered the death of his first wife. He had married, then murdered his second wife. He had married a third. He was tall and thick-set. He had a weak chin and protuberant blue eyes. He was vain about his appearance. He was vain about his voice. He believed himself to be one of the great singers of his age, and forced his servants and his soldiers and his courtiers to sit through long performances in which he would sing for hours on end, accompanying himself on a stringed instrument called the kithara. To leave the room during one of these performances was an act of treason, punishable by death. Some men, it was said, faked their own deaths and were carried out on stretchers just to escape. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but the world would simply remember him as Nero. This is the story of a fire, the largest fire in the history of the ancient world. A fire that would burn for 9 days, would destroy 2/3 of the largest city on earth, and would leave 100,000 people homeless in a single week. It is also the story of how a young emperor, already disliked, already feared, already beginning to lose the goodwill of his people, came to be remembered 2,000 years later as the man who fiddled while Rome burned. Most of what you have heard about that night is probably wrong. The truth is stranger and quieter, and in some ways sadder than the legend. Tonight, we travel to the city that was, to the streets that were, to the shops and the apartments and the temples and the chariot stadium where the fire began, to the moon that hung full and bright above Rome on the night of the 18th of July in the year 64. To understand the fire, we must first understand the city. Rome, in the year 64, was a city of contradictions. It was, by some estimates, the largest city in the world, perhaps 1,000,000 inhabitants, though no one truly knew. It had been growing for 800 years. It had absorbed, and then conquered, and then absorbed again, the wealth of dozens of foreign kingdoms. Its streets were paved with the marble of Greek temples and the gold of Egyptian tombs. And yet, for all its grandeur, most of Rome was made of wood. The marble buildings, the great temples, the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill, these were the postcards of Rome, the visions tourists carried home with them, the structures that survived the centuries. But the actual city, the city where ordinary Romans lived, was a maze of wooden apartment blocks. Insulae, they were called. Islands. Tall, narrow, stacked, leaning. Built quickly. Built cheaply. Built to make money for absent landlords. The lower floors were sometimes brick or stone. The upper floors, where the poor lived, were timber, plaster, and reed. The streets between them were narrow, sometimes only 6 feet wide. They wound and twisted and folded back on themselves, with no plan, no order, no logic. A man could turn a corner in Rome and become lost for an hour, in a city he had lived in his entire life. In summer, these streets baked. The wood dried, the plaster cracked. Cooking fires burned in every apartment. Oil lamps flickered through the night. There were no fire alarms. There were no fire codes. But there was, at least, a fire brigade. 40 years before the Great Fire, the Emperor Augustus had created a force of 7,000 men called the Vigiles, the watchmen. Their job was to patrol the streets of Rome through the long Mediterranean nights, watching for the first wisp of smoke, the first orange flicker behind a closed shutter, the first sound of a mother screaming in an upper window. They were former slaves, mostly, given their freedom in exchange for a lifetime of dangerous work. 6 years of service and a man could earn his Roman citizenship. It was a hard bargain. Many died before they reached it. They were organized into 7 cohorts of 1,000 men each. Each cohort was responsible for 2 of Rome's 14 districts. They worked in shifts, day and night, and their barracks were built in such a way that men could be on the street within minutes of an alarm. They carried buckets made of woven rope and lined with pitch, surprisingly waterproof and easier to pass hand to hand along a chain than a heavy bronze pail. They carried axes for breaking down doors and chopping through wooden beams. They carried hooks on long poles for pulling down burning roofs. They carried thick woolen blankets soaked in vinegar to be thrown over flames to smother them. They carried, for the worst fires, a kind of primitive water pump, a wooden cylinder with a piston operated by 2 men that could throw a stream of water perhaps 15 meters into the air. They were efficient. They were disciplined. They had put out 1,000 small fires over the decades. They had saved, almost certainly, tens of thousands of lives. But they had never faced anything like what was coming. The other thing to understand about Rome on the night of the fire was the wind. The summer winds of Italy are a particular thing. In July, a hot southern wind often blows up from Africa, across the Mediterranean, across the lowlands of Campania, and into the Tiber Valley. It is a dry wind. It is steady. It picks up speed as it funnels through the 7 hills of Rome, accelerating in the narrow valleys between them. The Romans had a name for this wind. They called it the auster, the wind from the south. On the night of the 18th of July, the auster was blowing. Not violently, not as a storm, just steadily. A warm, dry breath moving through the streets of the city, past the Circus Maximus, up the slopes of the Palatine, over the rooftops of the apartment blocks, out toward the gardens of the wealthy on the Esquiline Hill. Any breath strong enough to ruffle a curtain. Any breath strong enough also to carry a spark from one rooftop to another. It began at the Circus Maximus. This was the largest building in Rome, larger than any temple, larger than any palace. A vast oblong stadium, 600 meters long, 140 meters wide, built in a valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. It was a stadium for chariot racing. 250,000 spectators could fit inside, on stone benches that rose in tiers above the racing track. On race days, which were many, the streets around the circus would empty as the city poured into the stadium, screaming and gambling and chanting for their favorite teams. But on the night of the 18th of July, the circus was quiet. There were no races that night. The stadium was empty. The benches were dark. In the long arcades that ran beneath the spectator benches, however, there were shops. These were not grand shops. These were the small, cluttered, smoke-stained shops of Roman commercial life. Fast food stalls, wine cellars, cloth merchants, sellers of oil lamps and rope and pitch and resin and tallow. Flammable goods, all of them. Goods that would burn quickly, brightly, hungrily. The shops were closed for the night. Their wooden shutters were latched. Their owners had gone home, to their apartments somewhere in the maze of streets nearby. We do not know who left the lamp burning. We do not know if it was a lamp at all. Perhaps a hot coal raked carelessly to the back of an oven. Perhaps a candle knocked over by a cat. Perhaps a spark from a smith's hearth, drifting through a crack in the wood, landing on a pile of straw. We will never know. But sometime in the small hours of the night, perhaps 2 in the morning, perhaps 3, a flame caught hold of something dry, something flammable, and it began, very quietly, to grow. For a few minutes, perhaps, the fire was small, the size of a hand, then the size of a man, then the size of a room. The breeze drifted through the city that night, the summer oyster off the Tiber, carrying the smell of the river and the gardens and the sweat of a million sleeping people. The breeze entered the arcades of the circus through the gaps in the wooden shutters. It found the small fire. It fed it. It pushed it. The fire grew faster. By the time the first watchman saw the smoke rising above the Circus Maximus, the shops were already a wall of flame. He blew his whistle, a sharp, clear sound designed to carry across the city. He ran for the nearest barracks of the vigiles. Within minutes, a cohort was running through the streets toward the smoke. 200 men, buckets, axes, hooks. They had done this 1,000 times. They knew what to do. But by the time they reached the circus, the fire was no longer in the shops. It had jumped over the narrow alleyway into the wooden tenements that rose along the slope of the Palatine Hill. It had jumped again into the apartments behind those. It had jumped a third time into a row of warehouses where olive oil was stored. And then, the fire was no longer a fire. It was a storm. The Romans had a word for what was happening: conflagratio, a burning together, a burning of many things at once. In modern times, we would call it a firestorm. We would understand the physics, the way a large enough fire can generate its own wind, drawing in cold air from the surrounding streets, blasting it inward and upward, feeding the flames with oxygen, creating temperatures that can melt iron and turn stone to powder. The Romans did not know any of this. They only knew that something was happening that their fire brigade had never seen before. The flames were not staying where they began. They were leaping. They were jumping across streets. They were climbing buildings that should not have caught fire. They were creating their own wind, a hot, roaring wind that pulled the men's cloaks toward the flames, that snatched their voices away when they tried to shout to one another. The captain of the vigiles tried for a while to organize. Bucket chains were formed from the river. Houses were marked for demolition to create fire breaks. Orders were shouted, buckets passed. But the fire was moving faster than the men. As soon as a fire break was made, the flames had already jumped beyond it. As soon as a chain of buckets was formed, the building they were trying to save had collapsed in a shower of sparks. By dawn on the 19th of July, the captain of the cohort gave a different order. No more firefighting. Save the people. The bucket chains broke. The men scattered into the burning streets, pulling families from doorways, carrying the elderly on their backs, leading lines of crying children toward the river. The fire was no longer something that could be fought. It was something that had to be survived. The first to flee were those who lived closest. They woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke, the orange light flickering on their walls, the screams from the streets below. They grabbed what they could carry, children sometimes, bread, a pot, a bag of coins, a favorite lamp. They ran, out of their apartments, down the rickety wooden stairs, into the narrow streets, into the press of bodies already running. The streets that had been small and twisted in daylight were now choked with thousands of people. Mothers calling for children, children calling for parents. The old, the sick, the slow were trampled. Some fell. Some were not seen again. The lucky ones reached the Tiber and threw themselves into the river and clung to whatever they could find. The unlucky ones were caught in the streets when the wind shifted, when the flames came around a corner they had not expected, when the fire took the rooftop above them and the building came crashing down in a shower of burning timber. Tacitus, the Roman historian who was a child at the time of the fire, would later interview survivors. He would write of an old woman, half-blind, crawling on her hands and knees through the smoke, calling out the name of her dead husband. He would write of a father who carried his son for 3 miles and only realized at the end of the run that the boy in his arms was already dead. He would write of a young woman separated from her family in the panic, who simply sat down on the cobblestones, too exhausted to move, and waited for the flames to find her. These stories were not unique. They were the texture of the night, multiplied 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times. In one apartment block on the Celian Hill, a baker, a man known throughout his neighborhood for his honesty and his good bread, refused to leave without his oven. The oven had belonged to his father, and to his father before him. He had made bread in it every day for 30 years. The neighbors begged him to come. He would not. When the building collapsed, the baker and his oven were buried together beneath 3 stories of burning timber. In a small house near the Forum, a young Greek slave woman, perhaps 20 years old, returned to her master's burning villa. She had been sent away with the household to safety in the gardens beyond the walls. But she had remembered, somewhere along the road, that her master's elderly mother, bedridden, half-death, had been forgotten. The slave ran back. She entered the villa through a side door. She climbed the stairs through the smoke. We do not know if she reached the old woman. We do not know if either of them came out. The villa was found, days later, as a foundation of ash. In the quarter where the silk merchants kept their warehouses, a fortune in imported cloth, silks from China, linens from Egypt, wools from Britain, burned for 2 days, sending up clouds of strange-colored smoke. Pink smoke, yellow smoke, smoke the color of the sea. The poor of Rome, watching from the hills, said it was as if the gods themselves were burning the wealth of the empire. The wealthy fared no better than the poor. The senator Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Nero's old tutor, the philosopher, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, owned a mansion on the Esquiline Hill. He was not in the city when the fire began. He was at his country estate. By the time he was able to return, his Roman house was gone. So was his library, which contained perhaps 2,000 scrolls, original works of philosophy, copies of plays no longer performed, letters from his friends, drafts of his own unfinished books. All of it ash, the work of a lifetime. Other senators lost more. The historian Pliny the Elder, who would, 15 years later, die in the eruption that destroyed Pompeii, was a young man at the time of the fire. He was serving in the army, away from Rome, but his family's house, on the slopes of the Quirinal, was destroyed, along with the records of his father's commercial dealings, the inheritance he had been preparing to claim, the dowries his sisters had been preparing to receive. He would later write of returning to Rome weeks after the fire and finding the street where he had grown up unrecognizable. The shape of the hill itself, he wrote, seemed to have changed.
The emperor was not in Rome. Nero was at Antium, the modern town of Anzio on the coast, about 35 miles south of the city. It was one of his favorite retreats. He had a villa there near the sea where he could escape the heat of the Roman summer. He could swim, he could compose poetry, he could practice his singing, far from the polite, suffocating attention of the imperial court. He was at Antium when the messenger arrived. We do not know exactly what time the messenger reached him. The fire had been burning for perhaps 18 hours by then, 20 hours. The first horseman had been dispatched from Rome at first light when the scale of the disaster became clear. He had ridden through the morning and into the afternoon, changing horses at every station, until he reached Antium just as the sun was beginning its slow descent over the Tyrrhenian Sea. The messenger told the emperor what had happened. The fire, the circus, the neighborhoods, the thousands fleeing, the collapsing buildings, the screams. What did Nero do? For 2,000 years, this question has been argued, mocked, mythologized, painted, sung about, written into plays. The legend says that Nero climbed a tower in his palace, took up his lyre, and sang a song he had composed about the fall of Troy, while Rome burned in the distance. The legend is almost certainly false. He was not even in Rome when the fire began. He could not have watched from a tower in his palace. The palace itself, in fact, would burn that night. What he actually did was this. He ordered his horse saddled. He ordered his guards. He rode for Rome. We do not know what he was thinking on that long ride through the dark. We can imagine. He was a young man, 26 years old, who had inherited the largest empire in the world and had ruled it in the first years with surprising competence. He had cut taxes. He had reformed the courts. He had even, for a time, been popular. But that popularity had begun to slip. There had been the murders, the vanity, the endless performances, the whispers, the plots. And now this. The largest disaster in the history of his city, on his watch, in the 10th year of his reign. He was the emperor of Rome. He was the son of the gods, and his city was burning. He arrived in Rome before dawn on the second day of the fire. By then, 3 of the city's 14 districts were gone. 7 more were partially in flames. The fire was still spreading. The vigiles were exhausted. Some had died. Most had given up trying to put the fire out and were now simply trying to evacuate people, to clear paths, to keep the panic from killing as many as the flames. Nero walked through the burning streets without his guards. Tacitus tells us this. He walked alone, in the smoke, giving orders. Open the imperial gardens. Open the field of Mars. Open every public building. Bring food from Ostia. Cut the price of grain. House the homeless. Give clothing to those who had escaped in their bedclothes. Bring water from the aqueducts. Bring ladders. Bring axes. Tear down buildings in the path of the fire to create fire breaks. Whatever else can be said about Nero, and a great deal will be said, he did not in those first hours behave like a man who wanted his city to burn. The fire raged for 6 full days. On the first day, it consumed the valley of the Circus. On the second, it climbed the Palatine Hill, where the imperial palaces stood.
On the third, it crossed the Forum, the heart of Rome, the place where laws were debated and contracts were signed and gods were worshipped. The temple of Jupiter Stator burned. This was one of the oldest temples in Rome, older than the empire itself, older than the Republic. It was said to have been built by Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, after a battle with the Sabines 800 years earlier. Inside, the marble columns had stood since the days when Rome was a small town on a hill. They were brought down in a single afternoon by the heat. The house of the Vestals burned. This was the temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. Inside, 6 priestesses, chosen as children, sworn to 30 years of celibacy and service, tended a sacred fire that by Roman tradition had been burning continuously for over 1,000 years. The fire was the soul of Rome. If it ever went out, the city would fall. The Vestals saved what they could: the sacred objects, the ancient amulets, the secret tokens that no one outside the order had ever seen, and fled to a temporary shelter in the Forum of Augustus. The eternal flame they carried with them in a small bronze brazier. It did not go out.
The Domus Transitoria burned. This was Nero's own primary palace, built to connect the imperial holdings on the Palatine and Esquiline hills. He had spent years building it. He had filled it with art looted from across the empire. He had loved it, in his way. He stood in the Forum on the 3rd day of the fire and watched it burn. On the 4th and 5th days, the fire spread into the densely packed neighborhoods to the north and east. It climbed the Celian Hill. It climbed the Esquiline. It threatened to consume the entire city. By the 6th day, however, something had begun to change. The vigiles, working alongside soldiers and ordinary citizens, had begun to demolish entire neighborhoods ahead of the flames. Houses were pulled down with grappling hooks. Walls were broken open with battering rams. A gap was created, a strip of ruined ground 100 meters wide, where there was nothing for the fire to feed on. No wood, no oil, no cloth. Just bare earth and broken stone. When the flames reached this gap on the morning of the 7th day, they hesitated. They sputtered. They reached out, looking for fuel, and found only stone. And slowly, very slowly, they began to die. By the evening of the 7th day, the great fire of Rome was out. But the city was not safe. 3 days after the first fire ended, a second fire broke out, in a different neighborhood, on the estate of one of Nero's closest advisers, a man named Tigellinus. This second fire was smaller. It burned for 2 days. It destroyed temples and pleasure arcades, but killed fewer people. It was contained more quickly. But it was the second fire that made everyone start to wonder.
The numbers are difficult to know, even today. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 had escaped damage. 3 were utterly destroyed. The other 7 were ruins. Tens of thousands of buildings were gone. Tens of thousands of people were dead. Hundreds of thousands more were homeless. The grain warehouses were ash. The temples were ash. The shops were ash. 2/3 of the largest city in the world was ash. A faint smell of smoke would linger over Rome for months. Nero, in the weeks after the fire, threw himself into the work of relief and reconstruction. He opened his gardens. He housed the homeless. He brought in food from every province within reach. He cut the price of bread. He paid from his own treasury for the burial of the dead. He commissioned a comprehensive new building code. The new code was remarkably modern in its thinking. Streets had to be wider, at least 16 Roman feet, almost 5 meters, where the old streets had often been only 6. Buildings had to be made of brick and stone, not wood, in the lower stories. Every block of apartments had to have its own water supply, fed by lead pipes from the aqueducts. Every neighborhood had to have firefighting equipment, kept ready and visible at all times. He even mandated the construction of fire-resistant porticos, covered walkways, so that the citizens of Rome would never again have to walk in the open during a fire that came over the rooftops. These were good measures, sensible measures. A different emperor in a different year might have been remembered as the savior of Rome. But this was Nero, and the rumors had already begun.
It started with a whisper. Somewhere in the city, perhaps within hours of the fire being out, someone, we will never know who, claimed to have seen the emperor on the night of the second fire, standing on a high tower in the gardens of Maecenas, watching the flames. Singing, playing his lyre. Someone else claimed to have heard him, in the days before the fire, complaining about the ugliness of the old city, the narrow streets, the cramped apartments, the way that the imperial palaces were hemmed in by the rabbit warren of the poor neighborhoods. Someone else remembered that Nero had wanted for years to build a vast new palace, a palace such as the world had never seen, a palace that would require 120 hectares of land, half a square mile, in the very center of Rome. A palace that the Senate had refused to approve because there was no land available in the very center of Rome on which to build it. There was now. By the autumn of 64, the rumor had hardened into a story. By the winter, the story had hardened into a belief. By the following year, the belief had become, for many Romans, a certainty. The emperor had set fire to his own city. He had done it to clear the land for his palace. He had done it to immortalize himself by building a new and greater Rome on the ashes of the old. He had done it because he was mad, or vain, or both. He had stood on a tower in the imperial gardens and sung the song of the fall of Troy, while the screams of his own people rose into the smoke. This is the version of the story that has come down to us. This is the version that Suetonius, writing 50 years after the fire, would put into his biography of the emperor. This is the version that would be repeated with increasing certainty by writer after writer, century after century, until it became an unquestioned fact of Western history. But it is probably not true. Tacitus, our most reliable source, was a child at the time of the fire, perhaps 8 years old. He grew up to become one of the great historians of the ancient world. As a young man, he interviewed survivors. He read the official reports. He read the private memoirs of senators who had been there. And when he came to write the story of the fire in his great work, The Annals, he was, as historians say, non-committal. Tacitus did not claim Nero started the fire. He did not claim Nero did not start it either. He simply said, "Some say one thing, some say another. The truth is hard to know." This is the most damning sentence Tacitus could have written, if he had wanted to convict the emperor. But he did not write it. He did not say Nero was guilty. He hedged. He balanced. He left it open. And modern historians, who have read Tacitus carefully and Suetonius skeptically and Cassius Dio with great suspicion, have come over the last 100 years to a fairly clear consensus. It probably wasn't Nero. The arguments against him are strong. He was 35 miles away when the fire began. The fire damaged his own palace, the Domus Transitoria, badly enough that he had to abandon it and build a new one.
The fire began in a district where Nero had no particular interest in clearing land. The Domus Aurea, the golden house he eventually built, would rise on a different part of the city. And the night of the fire, a full moon was riding high above Rome. A poor night to choose if you were planning a secret act of arson, since you would be visible to every watchman in the city. The fire was, almost certainly, an accident. A summer fire, in a wooden city, on a hot night, with a wind off the river. The kind of fire that had happened 100 times before in Rome, and would happen 100 times again. This one simply happened to be larger. But Nero, in the weeks after the fire, made a decision that would haunt him, and would haunt history. He decided he needed someone to blame.
In the year 64, the Christians were a small and obscure religious sect. There were perhaps a few thousand of them in Rome. Most were poor, slaves, freedmen, foreigners, women of low status. They worshipped a Jewish prophet who had been crucified on the orders of a Roman governor some 30 years earlier in the province of Judea. They met in private houses. They shared meals. They sang hymns. They believed that the world was about to end, that their crucified prophet would return very soon in glory and judgment, and that the cities of men would burn. They were not popular. Their refusal to worship the Roman gods was, to the Romans, a form of atheism. Their secrecy made them suspicious. What were they doing in those locked rooms, they wondered, those poor and strange people? Some Romans believed that the Christians practiced cannibalism because they spoke of eating the body and drinking the blood of their god. Others believed they practiced incest because they called each other brother and sister. Others simply found them odd and disliked them on principle. Nero, in the autumn of 64, found in the Christians a perfect scapegoat. He had them arrested. He had them interrogated. Tacitus tells us, and Tacitus was no friend of the Christians, that they were tortured into confessing not just to the fire, but to a great many other crimes besides. Crimes they had not committed, crimes that did not exist. Then they were executed. The executions took place in Nero's gardens on the right bank of the Tiber, where the imperial circus stood, a smaller stadium, less famous than the great Circus Maximus, but private and used by the emperor for personal entertainments. Some of the Christians were sewn into the skins of wild animals, sheep, deer, boars, and then released into the arena where Nero's hunting dogs were set upon them. The crowds, it was said, were unsettled. They had come to be entertained, but this was something else. The screaming was wrong. The dogs were tearing apart not animals, but men. Other Christians were crucified. Crosses were erected along the avenues of the gardens, and the Christians were nailed to them and left to die in the slow, suffocating death of crucifixion. This was the same death their prophet had died 30 years earlier in Judea, though it would be many centuries before the cross became a symbol of triumph rather than horror. Others, finally, were used as torches. This is the detail that has chilled readers for 2,000 years. They were tied to wooden posts, smeared with pitch and resin, and set alight after dark. They burned alive, slowly, screaming, to provide light for the parties Nero held in his gardens. The orange glow of human bodies suspended in the dark illuminated the gravel paths and the marble fountains and the bowls of wine on the tables of the Roman aristocracy. According to one ancient source, the Christian writer Jerome, writing centuries later, the total number killed in this first persecution was 979. It is said, and Tacitus says this clearly, despite his own dislike of Christianity, that even the Romans began to feel pity. Even the Romans, who had cheered the death of gladiators and the deaths of barbarians, began to feel that this was too much. The Christians, they began to think, might not have started the fire. The Christians might have been blamed for the wrong reasons. The Christians might be innocent. The persecution petered out. Most of the surviving Christians fled the city or went underground into the catacombs that ran beneath the streets, where they would remain for 2 more centuries, hiding, growing, waiting. Their religion did not die. It grew. It spread. In 300 years, it would be the official religion of the empire that had once tried to extinguish it. The cross would replace the eagle as the symbol of Rome. The names of the Christian martyrs would be remembered for centuries. The name of Nero, who had killed them, would also be remembered, but not for the reasons he had hoped.
The Golden House was extraordinary. Domus Aurea in Latin, the Golden House, or, perhaps more accurately, the Golden Palace. Nero began building it almost as soon as the ashes of the fire had cooled. It would occupy somewhere between 40 and 120 hectares, depending on which ancient source you believe. A square mile, perhaps, in the very heart of Rome. On land that had, until recently, been the homes of thousands of ordinary Roman families. It was not a single building. It was a complex of palaces, set within a vast artificial landscape of gardens, vineyards, woodlands, and an enormous artificial lake, large enough to stage mock naval battles. The lake stood where, today, the Colosseum stands. The buildings were faced with marble and gold. The ceilings were inlaid with mother-of-pearl and ivory. The dining hall, the largest single dining room in the ancient world, had a domed ceiling that rotated day and night to mimic the movement of the heavens, while servants released perfume and rose petals through hidden vents above the diners. There were 150 rooms. There were fountains that flowed with wine. There was a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, 30 meters high, standing at the entrance, the largest statue ever made in the ancient world. It was so large that the road in front of it had to be widened. So large that 2 centuries after Nero's death, when the Colosseum was built on the site of his lake, it would be named after that very statue, the Colosseum, after the Colossus of Nero. Most of the Golden House is gone now. After Nero's death, his successors found it embarrassing, too lavish, too obscene, too closely associated with a hated emperor. They tore down the statues. They stripped the gold and marble. They filled in the rooms with rubble and built public baths on top of them. The artificial lake was drained, and the Colosseum was built where the water had been. The Golden House itself, buried under 15 centuries of construction, was forgotten. But it was not completely forgotten. In the late 15th century, 1400 years after Nero's death, a young Roman boy fell through a hole in a hillside near the Esquiline. He landed in a strange room. The walls were painted with extraordinary frescoes, fantastical creatures, garlands, perspective tricks, scenes of imaginary architecture. Word spread. Other Romans came to see. Among them were the painters of the Renaissance,
Raphael, Michelangelo, Pinturicchio. They lowered themselves down through the hole on ropes by torchlight to look at the paintings. They were astonished. They had never seen anything like it. They began to incorporate similar designs into their own work. The grotesque, this style would be called, after the grotto where it had been found. The buried rooms of Nero's palace would influence European art for the next 500 years. But none of this would happen for over 1,000 years. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Nero's golden house was simply this: a vast, glittering, impossible palace rising on the ruins of a city, paid for by a population that had lost its homes, surrounded by neighborhoods that were still, in many places, smoldering. The Romans hated it.
The hatred took time to crystallize. At first, there was simply unease, then resentment, then, slowly, anger. Nero seemed not to notice. He continued to perform on stage. He gave concerts that lasted for hours, sometimes days, in which he played the lyre and sang of heroes and gods. He continued to compete in chariot races, which he often won, because the other charioteers knew better than to defeat the emperor. He continued to build and to spend and to tax, to fund both the Golden House and the reconstruction of Rome. But the empire was straining. The provinces were growing restless. The cost of the new palace, on top of the cost of the rebuilding, was crushing. Taxes rose, then rose again. The aristocracy, which had always disliked Nero, began to plot. In 65, just 1 year after the fire, a conspiracy was uncovered. A group of senators and noblemen, led by a respected statesman named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, had planned to assassinate the emperor. The plan was to invite Nero to a country villa, ostensibly for a banquet, and to murder him there. The plotters numbered more than 40 senators, knights, military officers, even members of the Praetorian Guard. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. A freedman of one of the conspirators, a man named Milicus, betrayed the plot to the imperial household. He was rewarded with land, money, and the title of Savior of the State. The conspirators were arrested. Some were executed. Others, including Nero's old tutor, the philosopher Seneca, who was implicated, perhaps unfairly, were ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, then in his late 60s, opened his veins in his bath, while his wife, Pompeia Paulina, attempted to die alongside him. She survived. He did not. His last words, according to Tacitus, were a calm dictation to his secretary, a final philosophical reflection on the courage required to face death well. The poet Lucan, also implicated in the plot, also opened his veins. He died reciting his own verses about the death of a Roman soldier on a battlefield in Spain. He was 25 years old. The plot had failed, but the empire it had failed to overthrow was now, in many ways, broken. The senators who survived the purge were terrified. The remaining members of the imperial household watched their backs. Nero himself, increasingly paranoid, executed more men in the months after the plot than he had in the previous decade. The blood in those years did not stop flowing. Nero became more paranoid. He executed more senators. He executed his own pregnant wife, Poppaea, in a fit of rage by kicking her in the stomach. He executed cousins, friends, generals, anyone he suspected of disloyalty.
3 years passed. 4. The empire continued to fray. In the year 68, the governor of Gaul revolted. Then the governor of Spain, then the governor of Africa. The legions in the provinces declared other men emperor. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome itself, abandoned Nero. The Senate, finally, declared him a public enemy. He fled the city. He took refuge in a villa outside the walls. There, on the 9th of June, in the year 68, 4 years almost to the day after the Great Fire, Nero took his own life. He was 30 years old. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "What an artist dies in me." He had ruled for 14 years. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line that had begun with Julius Caesar more than a century earlier. With his death, the dynasty ended. The empire would continue. The empire would last another 400 years. But the Caesars, the bloodline of the great Julius, were finished.
What remained of the city in the end? A great deal, actually. Rome, after the fire and the rebuilding, was in many ways a better city than it had been before. The new building codes were enforced. The streets were wider. The buildings were of brick and stone. The water supplies were improved. The fire brigades were doubled in size. For all of his faults, Nero had, perhaps accidentally, perhaps reluctantly, given Rome a more livable face. The new Rome was beautiful. The new Rome was safer. The new Rome would survive, in much the same form, for the next 4 centuries, and many of its monuments still stand today. But the old Rome was gone. The crowded, chaotic, wooden Rome of the early empire, the Rome of narrow alleys and rickety apartments and shops crammed beneath stadium arcades, that Rome had burned to the ground in a single week in July and was never rebuilt. The maze of streets where ordinary people had lived for centuries was replaced by the orderly grid of Nero's new city. The small shops where the fire had begun were replaced by wide marble porticos. The crooked alleys where children had played and old men had argued and lovers had whispered for generations were straightened, widened, paved, and given names. This is what fires do sometimes to cities. They erase, they simplify, they impose on the memory of a place a clean line. Some Romans, walking through the new city in the years after the fire, were said to feel a sense of loss. Their old neighborhoods, the streets they had grown up in, the houses they had married in, were gone. The new streets were wider, but emptier. The new buildings were grander, but less alive. The new Rome was a planned Rome, a perfect Rome, a Rome that no one had asked for, a Rome built by a dead emperor on the ashes of a city he may or may not have burned. The legend of Nero, however, did not fade. It hardened. It grew. Within a generation, the story that he had personally set the fire and watched it from a tower singing had become received truth. By the 2nd century, Christian writers were calling him the Antichrist. By the medieval period, he had become a stock figure in the European imagination. The mad emperor, the cruel emperor,
the emperor who had murdered his mother and his wives and burned his city. Painters across Europe painted him. Composers composed operas about him. Writers from Tacitus to Racine to Tolstoy used him as a figure of warning, a reminder of what an unchecked ego, given absolute power, could do. In the 19th century, the painter Henryk Chmielewski painted an enormous canvas, Nero's Torches, showing Christians burning in the gardens of the Golden House while the emperor reclined nearby on a couch. In the 20th century, the novelist Henryk Sienkiewicz wrote Quo Vadis, a novel about a Christian girl in Nero's Rome, which was made into a Hollywood film in 1951, with Peter Ustinov playing the emperor as a vain, fluttering, lyre-strumming madman. These stories are not history. They are something else. They are the long shadow that one young man's reign cast across 2,000 years of Western imagination. The truth, as best we can recover it, is more complicated. Nero was not a saint. He was probably not the monster of legend either. He was a frightened, vain, talented, dangerous young man who inherited too much power too young and who broke under the weight of it. The fire was probably an accident. Nero probably tried in the first hours to save the city. He almost certainly did not start it. But he did persecute the Christians savagely, and he did build a vast palace on land where his subjects had once lived, and he did rule in a way that would, in the end, destroy him. The fire was the turning point. Before the fire, he was an unpopular emperor. After the fire, he was a hated one. The fire did not directly kill him, but it began the slow process of his destruction. The ashes, in the end, fell on him.
Tonight, 2,000 years later, you can still walk through the ruins of Nero's Rome. You can stand in the vast hollow shell of the Domus Aurea, the part of it that survives, buried beneath the Esquiline Hill, and look up at the painted ceilings that Raphael once climbed down to see by torchlight. The frescoes are still visible in places, faded, patient, waiting. You can stand in the Roman Forum and walk past the foundations of the temples that burned that night and feel the heat of the Italian summer rising from the same stones. The Temple of Vesta has been rebuilt and rebuilt again, and is now a circle of pale columns. The House of the Vestals, where the priestesses lived, is now a series of empty rooms open to the sky. You can sit on the stone bench where one of those women might have sat on a summer evening in the year 63 and watch the light change on the marble. You can stand at the edge of the Colosseum and remember that the lake of Nero's Golden House once filled this same valley, and that beneath your feet lie layers of ash from a fire that burned in this exact place 2,000 years ago. The city is older now than it was then. It has burned again several times in the centuries since. It has been sacked by Goths and Vandals and Lombards. It has been the seat of popes and the capital of kingdoms and the headquarters of empires. It has grown and shrunk and grown again. There are 7 million people living in the metropolitan area of Rome today, perhaps 7 times as many as lived there in Nero's day. But on a quiet summer night, when the tourists have gone home and the streets near the Colosseum are empty, you can still feel something, a kind of presence, a kind of memory that belongs to a different Rome.
a Rome of wooden tenements and narrow streets and full moons. A Rome where, on the 18th of July in the year 64, a small fire began in a shop near the Circus Maximus. A fire that no one noticed at first. A fire that grew. If you walk south from the Colosseum today on a quiet evening, you will come, after a few minutes, to a long oval depression in the ground. It is grassy now. There are footpaths around it. People walk their dogs. Children kick footballs across it on summer afternoons. This is what remains of the Circus Maximus. The benches are gone. The starting gates are gone. The chariots are gone. The shops where the fire began are gone. There is only this, a green oval in the center of a great city where, on a summer night 2,000 years ago, the largest fire in the history of the ancient world began. With a small lamp, perhaps, or a coal raked carelessly, or a candle knocked over by a cat. A fire that no one ever found the cause of. A fire that an emperor was blamed for. A fire that destroyed a city, that killed thousands, that elevated a small religion into the eventual faith of an empire, that built a golden house and brought down a dynasty. A fire that began so quietly that, when you stand on this grassy oval in the summer twilight, you can almost imagine it. The first whisper of smoke, the first orange flicker, the first watchman somewhere in the distance blowing his whistle. It is late now. Close your eyes. Let the city rest. Let the flames sleep. Let Nero rest, in whatever quiet place men like him rest. Let the Christians rest, who died in his gardens. Let the senators rest, who plotted against him. Let the slaves who carried buckets, and the bakers who would not leave their ovens, and the old women who crawled through the smoke calling for their husbands, let all of them, finally, rest. Let the long summer of the year 64 drift away.